It's awfully quiet in here. Does anybody order their coffee with less ice so they give you more coffee? You gotta do it. You gotta try it. Do you feel weird asking for less ice? No, because they keep the iced coffee chilled anyway. I just do it at Starbucks though. I won't do it at like some kind of little coffee shop. There was this girl who used to come into the coffee shop I worked at, which struggled as it was. The profit margins were really low at this shop. And she would come in and order a large cold brew with no ice in it, which is twice as much cold brew as you would normally get. And it's kind of rude. I gotta send this link to Nick. Ooh, I gotta be on Chrome for this. Anybody do anything fun over the weekend? No. Oh. Let's see here. There we go. Fair Nick. Oh, I gotta do top hat too. Okay. If you want to save desk space, feel free to just join the Pear Deck on your phone. It's not going to be anything. The couple Pear Deck things I have today aren't going to be anything too complex. So it might just be best to use your phone if you want to save the desk space. It's up to you though. Folks, I'm vaccinated and behind this glass and up here. Do you care if I teach without a mask on today? Would anybody be okay? You guys still, I mean, since you're close together, I still have to ask that you all keep your masks on. But as long as I'm up here, if anybody comes up to ask me anything at the end, I'll put it back on, okay? All right, let's get started. So today, well, does anybody have any questions before I start? You'll be able to do it. You should be able to enter it. There should be a prompt if you have any questions, as always. Nine. All right. Good question. Okay, we'll get started then. So today, just make sure everything will be recording. Cool. Okay. So, oh no, somebody always unplugs the clicker. Okay, so today we're finishing up module 10. We're doing public goods. So we're doing public goods and common resources, which is the second half of module 10. So this was stuff that was not included on the quiz because I didn't get to it yet, unfortunately. But basically the idea with this stuff is now that you've learned about externalities, now that you understand that there are certain things, the production and consumption of which affect other people, well, now there are things that because of that, we provide to society just through, through the government, basically, right? And so just to be clear, though, a public good, first off, is not every good funded through taxes, okay? So there is a specific definition that you need to know of what a public good is as far as economics is concerned. It is a good that is non-excludable, okay, and non-rival. So what does that mean? Non-excludable means you can't exclude anybody, okay? So, for example, the beach. Now, some beaches are private, right? But, the park, most beaches, walking on the rail trail, right? Anybody can do it. It's non-excludable. It's a public good, right? Because it's also non-rival. So my consumption of the good does not deplete the overall stock, right? So I took a very long walk on the rail trail yesterday, and it's non-excludable because anybody can go. And it's non-rival because me walking on the trail doesn't make it any less possible for you to walk on the trail, right? Okay, it's not like eating a slice of pizza. You eat the slice of pizza, it's gone, right? Every slice you eat is one less slice someone else can eat because pizza is, a rival good, right? Okay. So examples of public goods, public parks, the ocean, national defense, the local fire department, public health, police, right? These are things that everybody has access to, and any individual's use of which doesn't really deplete the use of anybody else. So it's a public good. It's non-excludable and it's non-rival. It's a very specific definition. And so generally speaking, thinking back to what we've been learning about with externalities, public goods generally exhibit positive externalities, right? And that's why we make them public, okay? Public education, right? Why are schools like this subsidized, right? This is a public university. If it makes its citizens more skilled, I mean, this university makes West Virginia a better state, right? West Virginia is a state that a lot of people, unfortunately, I don't know, look at as a state that people forget about, right? But West Virginia University does a lot to help this state, right? It puts this state on the map in a lot of ways in a lot of people's minds. And so the state funds this university because it creates positive spillovers and increases the skills of people in West Virginia. Okay, so any questions about that? Public goods. Okay. So again, public good is not necessarily something funded through taxes. A lot of them are, but specifically, it just means that it's non-excludable and non-rival. Okay. So then you have private goods, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. So private goods is, most of the stuff you interact with, your clothes, your laptop, your watch, your phone, your pencils. These are private goods. So they're both excludable and rival. Okay. Both excludable and rival. So the food you have for dinner tonight, it's excludable because it's yours, right? You get to decide if you share it with anybody. And it's rival because once you eat it, no one else can, right? So the use of the good, the consumption of the good, the consumption of the rail trail, right? Walking on the rail trail does not make it any less possible for someone else to walk. But the consumption of the dinner you have tonight makes it impossible for anyone else to have it. So it's rival in consumption. Okay. Something the textbook brings up to think about, right, is patents turn new inventions into private goods, right? So if I research some kind of, drug or something, that knowledge, right? Knowledge in a way would normally be non-excludable if you think about it, right? If you know the formula to create some kind of medicine, it's hard to keep that to yourself, right? Because it's like if it's non-rival and non-excludable on its own, because if you have the knowledge of how to make this medicine, your company can make it. So what do companies do? They put patents on things, right? We patent ideas and inventions. We turn certain things into private goods. So things that are less tangible, things like ideas, can get turned into private goods through patents. Okay. So a company does research, creates an invention, and then patents it so they can exclude unauthorized use, right? So private goods don't have to be things like food. They can be ideas as long as they're patented. Any questions? Okay. So this brings us to something called the free rider problem. This is something in economics, and it's one of the most commonly discussed issues. It's heavily studied in public economics, the field of public economics. And the free rider problem it is what it sounds like. It's the idea of free riding on public goods, right? So, public goods are funded through things like taxes, where everyone's expected to contribute, but not everybody contributes, right? I mean, ultimately, children aren't really paying taxes, right? A lot of people are people who are, I don't want to say, but basically not everybody pay. That's not really a value judgment. Just positively speaking, not everybody pays taxes, right? I mean, that's just a fact. And positively speaking, again, some people pay more taxes than others, right? And so ultimately, it's in your self-interest to reap the benefits of public goods while paying as little as possible. Obviously, right? Would you not love to not pay taxes, right? Your individual benefit for not paying taxes would outweigh the individual cost, right? Because every dollar you put into taxes gets spread out among, 300 million people, right? So ultimately, we'd all love to pay as little tax as possible. So what the free rider problem says is that everybody has an incentive to free ride, right? And so this is why private companies generally don't provide public goods. Because if you're providing a public good, nobody really has an incentive to pay. So why don't private companies maintain the parks and the trails, right? Well, because if you can't really exclude people and charge an entrance fee, there's not really much of an incentive to provide that kind of thing, because people, what if it were some kind of park where pay what you want, right? We just ask people to pay what they think is worthwhile. Well, most people probably just aren't going to pay at all. Maybe they'll throw $1 into the box, right? You'll have a couple random people who are really generous and might give a lot of money. But for the most part, your individual incentive is to just not pay at all and just use the service, right? And that's normal. That's not a value judgment. That's a normal thing. We assume people are self-interested, right? And so again, this is why private companies don't provide public goods, because there's no way to make money if you can't exclude people. So This is straight from the textbook. So let's model out this problem. So let's say we have two people in our town, Rachel and Samuel, and the cost of creating a local fire department would be $4, okay, for each of them. They'd each need to pay $4, okay? And the social benefit, let's say, of each $4 contribution is $6. So I pay in $4 and $6 of value are created. So I pay my tax of $4, and we'll say that $6 of value is created by the provision of this fire department in my town, right? But the social benefits split between both people, okay? And again, it's just a two-person town, simple model, right? So let's say they both contribute $4. So Rachel and Samuel both throw in $4 to the pot. Each of their $4 donations creates $6 worth of value. And here we are with $12 of social benefit created. Okay, so this $12 fire department. That's split between them. They each get $6 back. So they each spent $4 and got $6. So they both netted $2, right? So this works out. Works out nice. They make a fire department. They create this value, right? By creating this fire department in their town. But what if Samuel decides not to contribute and Rachel still does? Well, then what happens? Rachel pays in $4, which creates the social benefit of $6. But Samuel didn't throw in anything. So only $6 of value is created. The $6 is then split between them. Rachel gets $3 back, and Samuel gets $3 for free. So Rachel netted a $1 loss and Samuel nets a $3 gain. Samuel is a free rider. He's free riding on Rachel's payment of taxes into creating this fire department, right? Now here's the problem. This is the issue with the free rider problem. If everybody anticipates that everyone else is going to free ride, then everyone else free rides. So the idea is, what if Rachel anticipates that Samuel's going to free ride? Well, what's her best move? Just not do anything. Because if Rachel pays in to create this fire department and Samuel doesn't, Samuel gains and Rachel just loses money. So if Rachel anticipates this, she's going to decide herself not to contribute either. And so they both net $0 and there's no fire department. So this is a simplification, but this is the basis of the free rider problem. How do we solve this issue? This is a big issue in economics. How do we solve this issue? So we'll come back to this in a sec. So we call this, it didn't go step by step like I wanted it to. I'll explain these step by step. We call this the prisoner's dilemma, okay? Now, again, this is in the textbook, word for word in the top hat. So don't feel like you need to write down this whole thing. This is word for word in the textbook. I'm going to explain it to you because I think it's very interesting. It taps into something called game theory, which is a very interesting side of economics. So Rachel reasons this way. If Samuel does not contribute, then I only stand to lose from contributing. If Samuel does contribute, I only stand to gain by not contributing. Remember from before, if Samuel does not contribute while Rachel does, Samuel nets $3. If they both contribute, they net $2 each. So if I know that the other person is going to contribute, I'm better off just not contributing. Because instead of a $2 gain, I'll get a $3 gain. I have an incentive to free ride. I'm better off free riding. And so the idea is, in both cases, Rachel's best response to Samuel is to not contribute. Because if Samuel does pay for the fire department, I should just free ride. And if he doesn't pay for the fire department, well, I shouldn't pay in because then he'll free ride on me. So in both cases, your best response ultimately for yourself is to not contribute. Now, if they're both reasoning this way, the public good never gets built. And nothing happens. There's no fire department. This is why the government pays for public goods, right? The common solution to the prisoner's dilemma is some kind of enforcement mechanism. So what we do is we say, well, how about we have Samuel and Rachel enter into a contract? that says that they, there's some kind of threat of punishment where they both have to fund the fire department. That's what government is, right? That's it. So that's kind of like, that's the case for why we fund public goods with taxes, right? Because we get the free rider problem. Now, I thought I'd do a little bit of an aside here, and this will be, you might find this interesting. We're going to model this in game theory, and I'm going to show it to you. So let's go into the DocCam. Oh, no. This is in the textbook chapter, but I might just add this as bonus material in like a quiz or something. I promise you'll get credit for knowing this in some way, because this is some cool stuff. So let me share to the, okay. So what if, so let's model this in game theory. So what we do in game theory, and the most basic game theory stuff, is what we do is we draw this little table. Just a 2x2 table. We call this a matrix. You don't need to know that. And here's Samuel, and here's Rachel. And let's say that this is the decision to contribute, not contribute. And here's contribute and not contribute. Now, what we talked about is we know what the setup is, okay? If both of them contribute, they throw in $4. Each of their $4 creates $6 of value through this public good, and they net a $2 gain. So what you'd write is you write like a little 2 and a comma, and then another 2. Now there's a few ways you can do this, but generally speaking, the one on the left is the person on the left, and the pad on the right is the person on the top. So 2, 2 means that if they both contribute, Rachel gets 2 and Samuel gets 2. Now, if Rachel does not contribute, but Samuel does, we've agreed that Rachel nets $3 and Samuel nets -1. Same thing again. If Rachel contributes and Samuel does not, Rachel nets -1 and Samuel gets 3. And if neither of them contribute anything, both of them get a payout of 0. Now here's the fascinating outcome of this that I'm going to show you, that we just talked about, but now I'm going to show you in a matrix. What you may notice is that the one that probably looks best for society is the one in the top left. 2 + 2 creates $4 of value, right? The bottom left is really good for Rachel and not Samuel. The top right's really good for Samuel and not Rachel. But if you notice, if you were to add the numbers up in each box, you'd see that the top left one seems like the best, right? If we get the public good provided, they both get $2 of value, and here we are creating $4 of value in our society, right? We want to maximize social benefit. So it makes sense that the top left would be the ideal outcome. There's a problem with that, though. Let's take a look at this. Can somebody tell me? So now looking at the payoffs, if Rachel decides to contribute, Samuel has 2 responses. He can either contribute or not contribute. If Samuel contributes, when Rachel does, Samuel gets a payoff of 2. And if he decides not to contribute, he gets a payoff of 3. So what would Samuel's, what we call best response be to Rachel contributing? What would Samuel's best response be? Yes, to not contribute. And what we do is we just give it a little underline. So we'll underline the payoff on that one. So now what if Rachel does not contribute? What is Samuel's best response? To contribute or to not contribute? to not contribute. Okay, we're getting somewhere. So now we see in both cases, Samuel's best response is to not contribute. So now let's switch it. So now let's say that Samuel contributes. So now we're looking at this kind of vertical area here. And Rachel could either contribute and get 2 or not contribute and get 3. We can see Rachel does not contribute. Once again, if Samuel does not contribute, now we're stuck to this area over here. Rachel can either contribute and get -1 or not contribute and get 0. And what do we get again? Rachel does not contribute. We would say that both of them have what are called dominant strategies in not contributing, which means that they always choose not to contribute. And so what you do when you get 2 underlines in a box is you say that this is a Nash equilibrium. The Nash equilibrium. So this is from a famous economist named John Nash. There's actually a movie with Russell Crowe called A Beautiful Mind that I think came out in the 90s. John Nash was had very severe schizophrenia, and it took a toll on him very seriously later in his life. But he also was a genius, mathematician and economist, and he kind of, in a lot of ways, pioneered our understanding of strategic interactions. Okay, so stuff like this is used by governments in understanding, in planning war scenarios, in thinking about nuclear weapons. It's used by companies in thinking about competition. So now this is a very basic form of it, but so game theory is actually used in very complex processes by very powerful companies, organizations, and governments. So this is what's interesting about this. You may look at it on its surface and say, oh, well, they're going to end up here. But what's the problem? If we're here, both players have an incentive to what we call deviate. Because if I'm Rachel and I know that Samuel's contributing, well, I might just switch to not contribute and increase my payoff. Again, let's say we're up here. Once again, at contribute. I'm Samuel. Well, I know Rachel's contributing. I'm just going to switch my strategy to not contribute and increase my payoff from 2 to 3. At Rachel's expense, of course. Now, there are ways of complicating this, right? One way is, well, what if there's some kind of social cohesion here? What if they're friends? You come to agreements with your friends. If you were doing this with a friend, you could certainly agree and trust each other to end up here, right? That's fine. But that could be worked into the values. So here we're assuming that they don't value that they're not friends, that they're strangers, and they're only self-interested, right? And so we could add complications. We could say, what if there's some kind of enforcement mechanism? What if you go to jail for not paying your taxes, right? There are different ways. What if you're part of a culture where this kind of cohesion and working together is very valuable, right? What if this is your family? So there are all these different ways we could complicate this and figure out how to get the socially optimal outcome, right? But it's important to understand these kinds of things because this is how a way of thinking about people's behavior in the world. So that's a very basic introduction to game theory. It's in the textbook. It's, they're not going into too much detail about it, but I thought maybe you'd find that a little bit of a change of pace because game theory is something that, at least when it was shown to me, I was kind of surprised that this is part of economics. But yeah. So any questions about that? This is the one from the textbook, and I just put boxes instead of underlining. And so you see, this is the one where there's 2 boxes is the outcome we get, right? And so we actually call that the prisoner's dilemma because the first thing you learn in a game theory class is the prisoner's dilemma, which is this outcome is the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a very basic scenario where you have 2 prisoners and they can either both keep their mouths shut or both confess. And just like in this case, the socially optimal outcome seems to be for both of them to keep their mouths shut. But if you keep your mouth shut and I confess, I get out of prison and you get a heavy sentence. And if you confess and I keep my mouth shut, I get a heavy sentence. And so ultimately the outcome is similar to this one, where they both rat on each other, both get like a year in prison. Whereas if they both keep their mouths shut, they both get out of prison, right? And so it's a similar idea where you would think that, you know, if they could come to some kind of agreement, like it were the mafia or something, they could agree to both keep their mouths shut. But ultimately they both rat on each other because it's individually in their own interest, right? And so that's why it's called the prisoner's dilemma. But again, you can model this with the free rider problem. All right. Let me switch my screen share back. Any questions about that? Okay. All right. Let's see where we at. Okay, so the textbook points out that the market does provide, forgot to animate it step by step. Damn, hold up. Do I want, no, I'm not gonna do it. Okay, well, either way. So the market kind of provides some public goods, something like radio. Radio is non-excludable. As long as you can tune in, you can listen to the radio. The radio waves just kind of move out. They're moving through the air all the time, right? You can always tune in. And it's non-rival. My tuning in doesn't reduce your ability to tune in, right? So what do? They run ads, right? That's why every time you turn to a radio station, it's an ad for the local car dealership, right? Because it's a public good it is literally a public good in the sense that it's non-excludable and non-rival, right? We said public good doesn't just mean the government funds it. It just means that it's non-excludable and non-rival. So radio is non-excludable and non-rival because anybody can tune in at any time. But what do? They charge you by taking up some of your time. They run ads. Advertisers pay them to run ads and they take up some of your time. You spend some of your time listening to the ads on the radio. And then, of course, some public goods may have a private aspect. I don't know how that became one word, but you know, the public park is free to use, right? But you might pay for parking. You might have to pay to park your car at the park, right? So that's the idea with that. Okay. So any questions about that? So you can see how if there's a good that you really can't exclude people from and it's really non-rival, you find other ways. You run ads, something like that. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to talk about common resources. Do not mix these up with public goods. Common resources are non-excludable, but they are rival. So they're things that everybody has access to because they're out in public. They're on public land, maybe. But they're rival in the sense that there's some kind of finite amount of this thing, right? So it's not like going to the park or listening to radio. It's like fishing. Okay. It's like mining, right? It's a finite amount. So everyone has access, but my use reduces your ability to use, right? And so the ocean, the lake, the river, there's a finite number of fish, right? Now, of course, the fish multiply and breed, but ultimately it's not like sunlight or, you know, walking in the park, right? It's like there's a number of fish, and theoretically, if I fish enough fish, there's no more fish. Okay. It's going to be in the best interest you as an individual fisher, it's in your best interest probably to overfish. You want to get as much fish as possible. The problem is, what does that do? It creates negative externalities, right? Because if you overfish, you are increasing your profits, but you might hurt the long-term stock of the fish. And that's bad, right? If you don't give them a chance to multiply, you might hurt the stock of the fish. And so overharvesting is a problem with a lot of common resources, things like fish, okay? So we call this the tragedy of the commons. That's what this is called in economics, the tragedy of the commons. So the idea with the tragedy of the commons is that if you have a common resource, no individual has a private incentive on their own to maintain it. Society does as a whole, but no individual has a private incentive to maintain it. Any questions so far? Okay, keep it going. So since no one owns the ocean or the river, it's subject to overuse. No individual has an incentive to protect the fish from overharvesting, right? Now, of course, there are people who are very passionate about this. If you're a passionate environmentalist, you want to save the fish, that's understandable. But in general, right, what would be the problem? What would that person say is, well, there's not enough people who are doing what I'm doing, right? The problem is not enough people individually get enough pleasure or benefit from individually protecting the fish, right? So what do? Is we kind of, as a society, kind of agree, well, let's make it so no individual can overfish the fish, right? And so again, every fisher has an incentive to get as many fish as possible. And then the problem with this is that private ownership gives an incentive to preserve the resource long term. If I own my backyard, I'm sure many of you have mowed the lawn before, mowed your parents' lawn, maybe, I would assume. But you're not mowing the lawn at the local park for free. You're not going and just mowing the lawn everywhere, right? You're mowing your own lawn for the most part. And so people have an incentive to maintain their own stuff. I wash my car, but I'm not washing random people's cars, right? I'm not washing a rental car, right? I'm washing my own car because I have a long-term interest in maintaining its value. The problem is, of course, I'm not saying we should sell the ocean to people, right? So this is the problem, is it's kind of unreasonable to have somebody privately own the ocean or the river or the lake, right? And so what are some other solutions to this? So one solution could be, theoretically, well, maybe if somebody owned part of the ocean, they would maintain it. But that's kind of weird. That's kind of awkward to think about. How do we sell the ocean, right? So what do we do instead? We come up with ways of maintaining the long-term, of maintaining the longevity of these resources through certain kinds of regulations. Fishing licenses. Well, what's a fishing license for? It's a barrier to entry to make it a little bit more costly to fish. Not just anybody can go and fish. You got to get a license. And what do? There's a limited number of licenses they'll give out. Because if they just let anybody fish, you'd end up overfishing. And so what do? Is they have scientists that measure these things and say, okay, like, this is how many fish can be harvested, right, to maintain the resource long term. And stuff like this is, generally funded by tax money, because no individual has much of an incentive to do this, but society as a whole has an incentive, right, because it creates externalities. So you have people who measure this and say, okay, this is the number of fish that can be harvested. This number have to be left. You can't harvest the babies. You got to do this and that. And we create these kinds of regulations to maintain the long-term health of the fish in the ecosystem. So in 50 years, people can still fish, right? So there's specific seasons, there's harvesting limits, right? Social norms, right? So this comes up in the textbook, I think. I mean, I don't want to tread into stereotypes here. But there are certain cultures that you can probably think of that are very in touch with nature, so to speak, and they have a lot of respect for nature. And so there are certain social norms among certain cultures where you would say, well, they have their own social mechanisms where they're not going to overfish or overharvest because they have this like profound respect for the fish and the river and whatnot. And so in other words, there are ways outside of licensing. If people just have a lot like a deeply held belief where they get their own pleasure out of like, I'm preserving the environment, you know, my culture says that, you know, you can't overfish because you got to respect, you know, the longevity in the environment. These are things that exist, right? Okay, so it's actually in the slide. Yeah, so Native American tribes have been very good at preserving common resources, right? That's just the fact. Okay, they're very good at it because it's kind of cooked into their social norms that they have a lot of respect for wildlife and the environment, right? So there are actually certain laws in existence in the United States that give Native Americans on reservations certain extra privileges and rights to handle these things because the government kind of just trusts them to work it out, okay? Because they've been doing it for a very long time, okay? And so they have cultural norms that kind of, you know, act as harvesting limits in and of themselves, right? And of course, you know, if a population of a species drops dangerously low, governments ban harvesting, right? So if something is endangered, you're not allowed to kill it because it's endangered, right? So it's dropped too low, we have to maintain it, right? So those are ways of dealing with the tragedy of the commons. Any questions? Okay, I'll just make sure. We'll throw up a text prompt. Any questions about anything so far? Okay. Nope. All right. So we'll wrap up with a question. A question from the top hat that I thought was interesting and relevant. I hope some of you are still on Pear Deck. If you're not, it's okay. But maybe a few of you are. So the question is, you know, some researchers estimate that that all saltwater fish are going to be extinct by 2048. And this is due to overfishing. But there's way more demand for chicken and beef, right? Everybody's eating chicken and beef, chicken mostly. But neither chicken nor beef are in danger of extinction. So which of the following do you think best explains why that might be the case? Would anybody like to answer verbally? There's way more demand for chicken and beef, but chicken and beef are not in danger. Yes. It's A. Exactly. Let's see if the 4 responses are okay. Mostly A. Yeah. Oh, now we're nice. Yeah, folks, it's A. Now let me explain why it's A. It kind of explains itself, but the idea with this is that fish exist out in the ocean, right? In things that we have not conceptualized ways of truly harnessing, right? Chicken and beef are raised in controlled spaces on land that humans have mastery over the land, right? We don't have mastery over the ocean. We haven't figured out a way. We haven't explored all the depths of the ocean. We haven't figured out a way of divvying up the ocean. The ocean is kind of a wild card, right? Fish are non-excludable. It's like anybody can just go and throw out a line. Anybody can just take out a ship theoretically and harvest a bunch of fish. Chicken and beef are grown in very controlled situations. I can't just go onto someone's farm and grab their chickens. I can, but I'll get arrested, right? Of course, there are fish farms. That's true. But in general, fish are relatively non-excludable because anybody can go out into the ocean and pick up fish, okay? And so fish are an example of the tragedy of the commons. And so we think that saltwater fish might be extinct in 30 years, in 27 years, because they're non-excludable. You can't really do anything about it. Chicken and beef are raised on farms. you have these farmers who can exclude others, charge you for them and continually produce generation after generation of chickens. You can't really, it's not as easy with fish, okay? Because anybody can just go out. So that's the bottom line. All right. That's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, feel free to come on up and we'll talk about it.
Just got a quick question.
Yeah.
I'll get the schedule myself. We have one more quiz.
Yes.
But is the final this year? Is that gonna be optional?
Will the final be optional? I don't think the final would be optional.
Okay.
No.
No, I
Yeah.
just know because I had taken the sports last semester.
Oh, really? Oh.
So,
Yeah, I don't think it, I don't think it is.
Okay.
This is a question about crossing.
Yeah. Is that your ID?
My
Oh, yeah,
ID.
it was just right here.
Oh my God, someone said I left down the podium last week when I was in class.
Oh, well, there you go.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. You too.